In the face of disaster, some are left to drown, while others rise to become heroes. A homeless black boy risks everything to save a life. What happens next will change how you see courage, survival, and what it truly means to be a hero. The rain pounded against the pavement, turning the streets into rivers. The sky, once bright and full of warmth, had darkened into an angry swirl of gray. The ocean, which had once been a distant hum in the background of the coastal town, now roared with terrifying force. Waves crashed against buildings, swallowing roads, pulling cars into the depths. Malik stood in the middle of it all, soaked to the bone, his small frame trembling from cold and fear. He had nowhere to run, no home to seek shelter in. For as long as he could remember, he had lived on these streets, surviving on scraps, avoiding the judgmental stares of people who looked right through him. He had learned to move like a shadow, unseen, unheard. But the tsunami did not care about who was invisible. It consumed everything in its path. A deafening crack split the air as a power line snapped, sending sparks into the floodwaters. Malik flinched, stepping backward as the water rose around his ankles, then his knees. The wind howled, carrying with it the desperate cries of people fighting against the current. He watched as families clung to one another, scrambling for higher ground. He saw fear in their eyes, but he also saw something else, abandonment. That was when he saw her, a girl no older than him, struggling in the water. She clutched onto a broken piece of wood, her eyes wide with terror, as the current pulled her further away. She screamed for help, her small hands reaching for anyone who might come to her rescue. But no one did. Her family, caught in their own panic, had left her behind. Malik's heart pounded. He could leave. He could turn away, let the ocean do what it wanted. He didn't owe her anything. People like her had never noticed him before, never spared him a second glance when he sat on the cold pavement, begging for food. He had spent years watching people like her walk past, their lives untouched by hardship, their warmth and privilege a distant dream to someone like him. But none of that mattered now. The ocean did not care about race, about class, about where you came from. It swallowed everyone the same. And she was drowning. Before he could think, before he could talk himself out of it, Malik ran. The water was rising fast, rushing past his waist as he fought against the current. His feet slipped on debris beneath the surface, but he kept going, pushing forward with everything he had. The girl's cries grew fainter as the waves carried her further away. Malik's breath came in gasps, his arms burning as he swam harder, faster. A massive wave surged toward them, crashing against his back. The force sent him under, the world spinning as water filled his nose, his throat. Panic gripped him. He kicked wildly, breaking the surface just in time to hear the girl scream again. He saw her now, barely hanging onto the wooden plank, her body weak from exhaustion. "I'm coming," Malik shouted, his voice barely carrying over the storm. With one final push, he reached her, grabbing onto the plank just as her fingers started to slip. Her eyes met his, wide and full of fear. For a second, she didn't react. He could see the hesitation, the uncertainty in her face. A boy like him, someone she had been taught to ignore, to fear, was now her only hope. But the moment passed. She let go of the plank and grabbed his arm instead. I can't swim," she gasped, coughing up salt water. The streets had never been kind to Malik. For as long as he could remember, he had been drifting, moving from one shelter to another, sleeping in alleys, under bridges, or wherever he could find a dry place to rest. He had learned how to survive without warmth, how to keep moving even when his stomach ached from hunger, and how to remain unseen when people walked past him as if he didn't exist. The world had never given him much, but despite that, he had never let it make him cruel. He had seen kindness before, in small glimpses. The occasional shopkeeper who let him take leftover bread at closing time. The old woman who sometimes left an extra blanket near the bench where he slept. But those moments were rare. More often, people only saw him as another homeless black boy, someone to be avoided, ignored, dismissed. He had learned long ago that most people assumed the worst of him before he even spoke. The town he lived in was small, a quiet, coastal place where wealth and comfort were abundant, just not for kids like him. The houses near the shore were massive, with white fences and perfectly trimmed hedges. Families gathered in their backyards for barbecues and watched the sunset over the ocean without a worry in the world. Malik had seen their lives from the outside, had watched children his age running across green lawns, laughing, playing, safe in the warmth of their homes. That was never his life. Instead, he spent his days searching for food, avoiding trouble, and hoping the police wouldn't chase him away from whatever place he had managed to settle for the night. He never stole, never begged. He had pride, even when he had nothing else. And then the storm came. The sky had darkened early that morning, heavy with an eerie silence, before the winds began to howl. People rushed to board up their homes, dragging supplies inside, locking their doors. Malik had no door to lock, no home to protect. He had only the clothes on his back and the instinct to run when the first wave crashed into the streets. The tsunami hit with a force that shattered everything in its path. Water surged through the town, swallowing roads, sweeping away cars, breaking apart buildings as if they were made of paper. People screamed as they fought to stay above the floodwaters, clinging to anything that could float. The world had turned into chaos. That was when he saw her, a girl about his age, trapped in the rushing water. She was holding onto a broken street sign, her body half submerged, her small fingers barely gripping the slick metal. Her blonde hair was plastered to her face, her pale skin ghostly against the stormy sky. She was coughing, gasping, her wide blue eyes darting around in terror. Her name was Sophie. Malik didn't know much about her family, but he had seen them before. They were the kind of people who lived in one of those big houses near the shore, the kind of people who never noticed him when they passed by in their expensive cars. And now they were gone. He had watched it happen only moments ago. He had seen Sophie's parents, frantic with fear, making a desperate choice. They had other children, younger ones, clinging to them as they waded through the rising water. They had looked at Sophie, their eldest, their strongest, and then at the waves crashing toward them. And in that split second, they had let her go. Malik had seen it in their eyes, the hesitation, the guilt, but also the decision. They thought she wouldn't make it. They thought trying to save her would risk them all. And now she was alone. A deep, bitter feeling settled in Malik's chest. They had left her, just like so many people had left him. He could have walked away. He could have told himself it wasn't his problem. After all, she was just another rich kid, another person who had never spared him a second glance. But none of that mattered now. The water was pulling her under. Malik's heart pounded as he took a shaky step forward. The storm didn't care about race, about class, about who deserved what. It didn't care about the invisible lines that separated people like him from people like her. It swallowed everything in its path, and if no one else was going to save her, he would. He sucked in a deep breath, forcing his shaking legs to move. The water was rising fast, rushing past his waist as he fought against the current. His feet slipped on debris beneath the surface, but he kept going, pushing forward with everything he had. Sophie's cries grew fainter as the waves carried her further away. Malik's breath came in gasps, his arms burning as he swam harder, faster. He saw her now, barely hanging on, her fingers slipping, her eyes locked onto his, and in that moment he saw something he hadn't expected. She didn't look at him with fear. She looked at him with hope. Because in this moment, in this storm, he wasn't a homeless boy. He wasn't the child people avoided on the streets. He was the only person who could save her. And that was exactly what he was going to do. The roar of the storm drowned out everything, the wind howling like a wild animal, the crashing waves consuming everything in their path, and the relentless pounding of rain against the ruined town. The streets had turned into violent rivers, swallowing homes, cars, and people who hadn't made it to higher ground in time. The air was thick with panic, screams echoing between the gusts of wind, but Malik could only focus on one sound, the desperate cries of a girl fighting for her life. His head snapped toward the voice, and through the sheets of rain he saw her. Sophie. She was struggling in the water, her small frame barely staying above the surface as the current dragged her further from safety. The jagged remains of a broken rooftop floated nearby, the waves pushing it toward her like a cruel tease, hope just out of reach. She clawed at the water, kicking, gasping, but she was losing. Malik's heart slammed against his ribs. He didn't stop to think. Without hesitation, he plunged into the flood. The icy water swallowed him whole, knocking the breath from his lungs. The current wrapped around him like a fist, trying to drag him under, but he fought against it, kicking his legs hard, forcing his way forward. The water was thick with debris, shattered wood, pieces of metal, things that could tear him apart if he wasn't careful. His arms burned as he pushed through, his body screaming for rest. But he didn't slow down. Sophie's head dipped beneath the surface. Panic shot through him. He dove, his hands searching blindly in the murky water. For a terrifying second, he found nothing, only darkness, only emptiness. Then skin. His fingers closed around Sophie's wrist, and with everything he had left, he yanked her upward. She broke through the surface with a choking gasp, her arms flailing wildly before latching onto him. Her body trembled with fear and exhaustion, her fingers digging into his shoulders like a lifeline. "I've got you," Malik rasped, spitting out salt water. His muscles burned, every part of him aching, but he refused to let go. The current wasn't finished with them yet. The waves crashed against his back, pushing them dangerously close to a submerged car. The sharp edge of a broken windshield glinted in the dark water, inches from them. Malik twisted, using his own body as a shield, feeling the sting of something slicing across his leg. He bit down a cry of pain, keeping his grip on Sophie tight. They needed to get out of the water. His eyes darted around, searching for anything they could climb onto. Then he saw it, the floating rooftop. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. "Sophie, hold on to me," he ordered, his voice steadier than he felt. She didn't question him. She wrapped her arms around his neck, clinging to him as he swam toward the wreckage. Every stroke felt heavier than the last. His limbs felt like lead, his lungs burning with exhaustion. But he kept going. By the time they reached the rooftop, his arms were shaking. With a final burst of strength, he shoved Sophie up onto the platform. her small body collapsing onto the damp wood. Then, using what little energy he had left, he pulled himself up beside her, gasping for breath. They had made it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued to hammer down, the storm showing no signs of mercy. Sophie coughed, trying to catch her breath, her entire body shivering. Malik forced himself upright, scanning the water for any signs of rescue. In the distance, he could hear voices, people calling out, searching for survivors. He turned back to Sophie. Her blue eyes, wide and scared, met his. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Malik didn't respond right away. He wasn't used to hearing those words. People had never seen him as someone worth saving, let alone as a hero. But here, in this moment, it didn't matter where he had come from, what he looked like, or where he slept at night. He had saved her. And for the first time in his life, someone saw him for what he truly was. "We're going to be okay," he said, more to himself than to her. As they huddled together on the floating wreckage, waiting for help, Malik felt something shift inside him. This moment, this act of bravery, would change everything. The morning after the storm, the town was unrecognizable. The once lively streets were buried beneath mud and debris, cars overturned, homes destroyed. The floodwaters had begun to recede, leaving behind the wreckage of what had once been normal lives. The air was thick with the sound of helicopters hovering above, rescue workers shouting, families crying as they searched for missing loved ones. On a patch of dry land near a collapsed building, Sophie sat wrapped in a thick blanket, her blonde hair still damp, her small hands gripping a cup of warm tea someone had given her. Her body trembled, not from the cold, but from everything she had been through. She kept looking around, searching for the one person who had been by her side through it all, Malik. She spotted him a few feet away, standing off to the side, alone, as he always was. He was watching the rescue team's work, his face unreadable. His clothes were torn and still wet from the flood, his bare feet caked in mud. But there was no one rushing to him, no one wrapping him in a blanket or pressing him into a hug. Then Sophie's parents arrived. They ran to her, their faces etched with fear and relief. Her mother dropped to her knees, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Oh, Sophie, my baby, I thought we lost you," she sobbed into her daughter's hair. Her father knelt beside them, gripping Sophie's arms, scanning her as if to make sure she was real. Sophie didn't react the way they expected. She didn't immediately melt into their touch or cry with relief at seeing them. Instead, she turned to look at Malik. "He saved me," she said softly, her voice hoarse. Her parents blinked, confused. Sophie pulled away slightly and pointed to Malik. "Him. He saved me. He went into the water and pulled me out. He got me onto a rooftop and stayed with me all night." Her mother followed her gaze, her lips parting slightly, when she finally saw the boy Sophie was talking about. Her father, too, turned his head, his expression shifting. Malik saw them looking. He had seen that look before. Uncertainty, hesitation, the silent questions forming in their minds. Him? How? For a long moment, no one said anything. Then Sophie's father stood up. He walked toward Malik, slowly, his hands still shaking from the fear of almost losing his daughter. You saved my daughter?" he asked, his voice quiet, as if he couldn't quite believe the words coming out of his own mouth. Malik shrugged slightly. "She needed help," he said simply. It wasn't an answer filled with grandeur, no dramatic proclamation of heroism. It was just the truth. Sophie's father swallowed, guilt creeping into his expression. He had seen this boy before, on the streets, near the grocery store, sometimes by the town's park. He had never paid him any attention. In fact, when he had seen him before, he had instinctively looked away, assuming he was up to no good, assuming he was just another lost cause. And yet, when it mattered most, this was the boy who had risked everything to save his daughter. Sophie's mother stepped forward, her eyes filling with tears. "We left her behind," she whispered, mostly to herself. "We thought we had no choice. We thought—" She trailed off, looking at Malik, truly seeing him for the first time. "But you didn't leave her." Malik said nothing. A lump formed in Sophie's father's throat. He had spent years thinking he understood the world, that he knew who to trust, who was worth something, and who wasn't. But now, standing in front of this boy, he felt his own ignorance weighing on him like a heavy stone. Behind them, murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. People were listening. "That's the boy who saved Sophie. I've seen him before. He's always around town. He went into the flood to get her? Alone?" Slowly, realization spread. People who had once looked through Malik as if he didn't exist now saw him in a different light. They saw the boy who had no home, no family, no one to run to after the storm, but who had still risked his life for someone else. They saw what they had refused to acknowledge before, that he was more than what they had assumed. Sophie's father let out a slow breath and extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady now. Malik hesitated before shaking it, the roughness of the man's palm unfamiliar against his own. Sophie stood up then, stepping between them. She reached out, grabbing Malik's hand like she had the night before, when they had clung to each other for survival. "He's my friend," she said firmly, looking up at her parents. "He saved me." The words carried weight. Malik had never been called a friend before. The town had always ignored him. People had walked past him, avoided him, crossed the street when they saw him coming. But now they whispered his name with something new: respect. A firefighter walked over, draping a warm blanket around Malik's shoulders. It was the first time someone had done that for him. A paramedic asked if he needed help, if he was hurt. Another rescue worker handed him a bottle of water. For the first time in his life, Malik wasn't invisible. The weight of what had happened settled over the crowd. This wasn't just a story about a girl being saved from the flood. It was about who had saved her, about the boy they had all ignored, about the way they had judged him before knowing him, about how they had assumed he was nothing, until he became everything. As Sophie's parents guided her away toward the rescue team, her mother looked back at Malik one last time. She didn't say anything, but her expression said enough. She knew she had been wrong. The entire town did. And Malik? He wasn't looking for their validation. He hadn't done what he did to prove anyone wrong. He had saved Sophie because she needed saving, because that was who he was. But as he stood there, the sun breaking through the clouds for the first time since the storm began, he couldn't help but wonder, maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Maybe, for the first time in his life, the world was finally ready to see him. The town gathered in the heart of what was left of the community center, now a makeshift shelter for those displaced by the tsunami. The storm had taken so much, homes, businesses, even lives, but it had also left something behind. A reckoning, a chance to see things differently. Sophie's parents stood at the front of the room, surrounded by familiar faces, neighbors, friends, even strangers who had once shared their unspoken beliefs about the world, about people like Malik. They were no longer the same people who had fled the storm in terror, leaving behind their daughter in a split-second decision they would regret forever. They had been changed, shaken not just by the disaster, but by the courage of a boy they had never once looked at before. Sophie stood beside them, holding Malik's hand. She had refused to leave his side since the moment they were rescued, refusing to let him fade into the background, as he always had before. Sophie's father cleared his throat, his voice unsteady as he spoke to the crowd. I don't know how to begin," he admitted. "There is no excuse for what we did. We made a terrible choice, and we almost lost Sophie because of it." His voice broke slightly, and he turned toward Malik. "But because of you, she's alive." Malik looked up at him, unsure of what to say. He had never needed thanks, never expected it. He had done what was right. That was all. Sophie's mother stepped forward, her hands clasped together as she scanned the crowd. "We failed our daughter," she said, "but more than that, we failed him." She turned toward Malik, her eyes brimming with guilt. "For years, we and so many of you have ignored this boy. We've looked away when we saw him in the streets. We've assumed the worst. We never once thought to ask his name or to see him as anything other than an outsider." She took a deep breath, her voice thick with emotion. "And yet, when our daughter needed help, he was the one who saved her." The room was silent. Everyone in that space knew what she meant. They had all seen Malik before, sitting on the curb outside grocery stores, resting near the park benches, walking alone at night with nowhere to go. They had seen him, but they had never acknowledged him. Sophie's father turned to Malik once more. "We can never repay you for what you did," he said, "but we want to try. We don't just want to thank you. We want to give you what you've never had." He paused, his words careful, heavy. "A home." Malik's breath caught in his throat. A home. The word felt foreign to him, something that belonged to other people, but had never belonged to him. He had slept under streetlights, curled up in alleyways, drifted from shelter to shelter. He had learned not to dream of things like this. But as he looked into their faces, he saw something he had never seen before. Genuine sincerity. Sophie squeezed his hand. "Please," she whispered, "come home with us." For the first time, Malik couldn't stop the lump that formed in his throat. He had spent his whole life being strong, teaching himself not to need things he could never have. But now, for the first time, he was being offered something. Not pity, not charity, a family. Slowly, he nodded. The crowd murmured, a ripple of emotion spreading through the room. What had begun as a simple rescue had turned into something bigger, something that forced everyone to confront what they had ignored for so long. A man in the crowd stepped forward, his face weathered, his hands shaking. "I own the diner downtown," he said. "Malik, if you ever want a job, you have one." Another voice called out, "I run the youth center. We could use someone like you to help mentor the younger kids." One by one, people spoke, offering help, offering kindness. Malik had never expected this. He had never expected any of this. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just a nameless boy on the streets. He was Malik, a hero. Sophie's parents had made a choice in the storm, one they would always regret. But now, in the aftermath, they made another choice. To change. To open their home. To do what they should have done long ago. See Malik not as an outsider, but as one of them. As Malik stood there, surrounded by people who had once ignored him, He realized that one moment of bravery had rewritten his entire life. He had saved Sophie, but in doing so, he had also saved himself. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that he was no longer alone. The storm had come and gone, leaving behind a town forever changed. The floodwaters had receded, the debris had been cleared, and life had slowly begun to rebuild itself. But some things could never return to how they were before. Some things had shifted too much, their impact too great to ignore. For Malik, the boy who had once been invisible, the world now saw him in a way it never had before. He had spent his life being overlooked, judged before he even had a chance to speak, cast aside because of where he came from and what he didn't have. But when the moment came, when the floodwaters rose and a girl's life was slipping away, it hadn't mattered where he slept at night or what clothes he wore. It hadn't mattered that no one had ever given him a second thought. All that had mattered was what was in his heart. He had saved Sophie not because he wanted recognition, not because he thought it would change anything, but because it was right, because she had needed saving, and he had the power to help her. In that moment, he had made a choice, and that choice had altered the course of his life in ways he could never have imagined. The town had learned something, too. For years, they had passed Malik on the street, their eyes looking past him as if he weren't even there. They had drawn conclusions about him without knowing a single thing about who he really was. They had allowed their prejudices to create a barrier between themselves and someone who had more courage, more heart, than most of them had ever shown in their entire lives. But the flood had washed those illusions away. Now, they spoke his name with respect. They looked at him not as a nameless boy who drifted through the streets, but as a hero. And maybe that was the real miracle. Not that Malik had changed, but that everyone else had. Sophie's parents had been the first to admit their faults, to say out loud what many others had been too ashamed to acknowledge. They had judged Malik before knowing him. They had assumed he was nothing, when in reality, he had been the only one willing to do everything. And they hadn't just apologized. They had taken action. They had given Malik a home. For the first time in his life, he slept in a bed that was his own. He had meals that were set at a table, where people sat across from him and asked him about his day. He had a place to belong, a family that saw him as more than just a boy who had once been lost in the world. But more than that, Malik had found something even greater, a future. The town had rallied around him, wanting to make up for the years they had spent ignoring him. Opportunities that had once seemed impossible were now within reach. He had been given a place in school, a chance to learn, to grow, to build something for himself beyond just surviving. And yet, through it all, Malik remained the same. He never let the recognition get to him, never let the title of hero change who he was at his core. Because the truth was, he had always been that person. The only difference was that now, the world finally saw him. His story became one that people told not just in the town, but beyond it. News outlets picked it up. Social media spread it far and wide. The story of the homeless black boy who had risked everything to save the life of a girl from a world that had never welcomed him. And while the attention came and went, the lesson it left behind remained. People started to question the way they viewed others. They thought twice before making assumptions, before dismissing someone because of their circumstances. They looked at those they had ignored before and wondered, what if we've been wrong about them too? Because if Malik had taught them anything, it was that heroism doesn't come from wealth or privilege. It doesn't come from the way someone looks, or where they come from, or what the world expects of them. It comes from the choices we make when no one is watching. Malik had proven that true bravery isn't about who deserves to be saved, but about who is willing to save. He had reminded the world that sometimes the ones we least expect are the ones who show us the way. And in the end, that was the greatest rescue of all.